Hello Year 11s and welcome to this video on consumer behaviour and decision making. There are 4 things that you need to do while you're watching this video. The first thing is to take the very best Cornell notes that you can. The second thing is to use the pause and rewind functions. Use the pause function if you need to stop this video to take notes. Use the rewind function if you want to go over any information contained in this video. The third thing that you need to do is to have your vocabulary sheets open in front of you so that you can write into your vocabulary sheets the definitions of key terms or of any other words the meaning of which you're unfamiliar with. And the fourth thing that you need to do is to have your summary books open in front of you. As we go through this video, I will give you guidance as to what you should write in your summary books. Once you've finished watching and taking notes on this video, make sure that you read the pages from the textbook referred to on this slide. And if you find any additional information from that reading that you think is useful, then make sure that you supplement your Cornell notes with that additional information. Well, let's get started then. The first learning intention for this video is that you should be able to explain the factors that affect consumer behaviour according to the traditional economic viewpoint. These factors are rationality, self-interest, informed decision-making, maximisation of utility, marginal benefits from consumption, and ordered preferences. Make sure that you write this learning intention down in your Cornell notes. There is also a second learning intention for this video, but I'll tell you about this once we have dealt with the first learning intention. Consumer behaviour looks at why, how, where and when consumers choose to purchase or not purchase a good or service. The important point for our purposes is that traditional economic theory, that is, the traditional economic viewpoint, makes a number of assumptions about the behaviour of consumers. Remember that in economics we need to make assumptions because the real world is very complex, and so to understand the real world it is necessary to make simplifying assumptions. So, for example, one of the assumptions that we will look at is that consumers act rationally, that is, logically. Now, we know that, in fact, consumers do not always act rationally. For instance, a rational consumer would not smoke because the long-term health consequences of smoking are so severe. Many consumers still smoke, presumably because it gives them a short-term benefit in stress relief or a boost to their reputation among their peers. But the fact remains that the long-term costs of smoking outweigh the short-term benefits, and so the rational decision for a consumer is not to smoke. Traditional economic theory assumes that all consumers act rationally because it is too difficult to try to model consumer behaviour that is not rational. If a consumer's behaviour is not rational, how can we predict what it is likely to be? I have classified the factors that traditional economic theory assumes to affect consumer behaviour in relation to decisions about the purchase of goods and services into 4 groups. What I would like you to do now is to draw up this table in your summary books. As we go through this video, please write in each assumption in the left-hand column, include a description of that assumption in the middle column, and then include your own example to illustrate the application of that assumption in the right-hand column. I will give you my examples, but I want you to come up with your own examples. Let's look at each of the 4 groups of factors or assumptions. First, consumers are assumed to act rationally, that is logically, and in their self-interest, that is, in a way that maximizes their overall satisfaction. For example, a rational consumer will choose to buy a hamburger rather than a bunch of carrots where they value the taste of the hamburger more than the health benefits of the carrots. This is because when a consumer has to choose between purchasing two different types of products, a rational consumer will purchase the product that has the highest net benefit to the consumer. That is a logical decision to make. Similarly, a consumer will buy a product at the lowest possible price. This is because it is in the consumer's self-interest to spend their income in a way that enables them to satisfy as many of their needs and wants as possible. A self-interested consumer is focused on maximizing their own satisfaction. For example, if roast chickens at Coles sell at a discount on Friday night and our consumer wants to buy one roast chicken per week, then the self-interested consumer will buy a discounted chicken on Friday night rather than a fully priced chicken on Saturday morning. This is so even if there is only one discounted roast chicken left and the other consumer who wants that chicken is an old age pensioner who cannot afford to buy fully priced roast chickens and is not quick enough to pick up the last discounted chicken. Second, consumers are assumed to have all the information that they need to make the best possible decision. For example, a consumer who is trying to decide what make of car to buy is assumed to have all of the information that they need to choose the car that will give them the highest net benefit. This information will include information about the fuel efficiency, safety features, comfort, warranties, servicing costs, and so on about all the different makes of car that the consumer could buy. In this way, the consumer is fully informed about all the advantages and disadvantages of the different makes of car, and so is in a position to make the most rational decision, that is, to buy the car that gives the consumer the highest net benefit. Third, consumers are assumed to make decisions that maximize their utility, that is, their satisfaction, taking into account the law of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility is that the benefits of consuming each additional unit of a product, that is, the marginal benefits from consumption, decrease as the number of units of that product that are consumed increases. We can illustrate this law by considering your consumption of Coca-Cola. On a hot day, you will get maximum utility, that is maximum satisfaction, from consuming your first cold can of Coke. You're hot and sweaty. The Coke is ice cold and it immediately satisfies your need for a drink to cool you down and to satisfy your thirst. If you were then to drink a second cold can of Coke, that would give you some satisfaction, but not as much satisfaction as you got from consuming the first cold can of Coke. You would get even less satisfaction from consuming your third cold can of Coke, because by now you've cooled down and you're not thirsty at all. In fact, the third cold can of Coke is likely to make you feel bloated and sick. This is why businesses need to provide incentives, such as price discounts, to encourage consumers to buy a larger number of the same product. For instance, you might buy the third cold can of Coke even though you had no strong desire for it if it only cost you 50 cents rather than the usual price of $3. Fourth and finally, consumers are assumed to rank their preferences for products and to first consume those products that give them the highest net benefit. For example, because a rational consumer will value their survival more highly than their enjoyment of life, they will satisfy their needs, such as their need for water, food, shelter, and clothes, before they satisfy their wants, such as their desire for an overseas holiday or to go to the football or a cinema. This means that if a consumer only has enough income to satisfy their needs, then they will prioritize buying products that satisfy their needs and will not buy any products that satisfy their wants. Now that we've dealt with our first learning intention, we can move on to the second learning intention for this video. This learning intention is that you should be able to explain the ways in which consumers and workers might respond to incentives and disincentives. The incentives that we'll be looking at are consumer subsidies and tax rebates. The disincentives that we'll be looking at are taxes and regulations. Make sure that you write this learning intention down in your Cornell notes. The key point here is that governments can use incentives and disincentives to change the behaviour of consumers as economic agents. That is, governments can use incentives and disincentives to change the behaviour of consumers in relation to their decisions about the purchase of goods and services. An incentive is something that is designed to encourage behaviour that would not otherwise occur to the same extent. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term incentive and write this definition in there. Governments use incentives to influence consumer decision-making by encouraging consumers to purchase a product whose consumption results in a benefit for the consumer or for society. The two most common incentives that governments use to encourage consumers to purchase a product are consumer subsidies that are paid to consumers and tax rebates that are given to consumers. Consumer subsidies are cash payments that the government pays to consumers. For example, the government pays consumer subsidies to consumers who install solar energy panels. This encourages consumers to install solar energy panels because the government payment reduces the cost of solar energy panels for consumers, and so consumers are more likely to install solar energy panels. Similarly, the government pays consumer subsidies to consumers who install rainwater tanks. This encourages consumers to install rainwater tanks because the government payment reduces the cost of rainwater tanks for consumers, and so consumers are more likely to install rainwater tanks. And the government pays childcare subsidies to consumers who put their children in childcare. This encourages consumers to put their children in childcare because the government payment reduces the cost of childcare for consumers, and so consumers are more likely to put their children in childcare. Finally, the government pays for the cost of consumers being given COVID injections. This encourages consumers to have COVID injections because they are free, and so consumers are more likely to get vaccinated against COVID. Tax rebates, also known as tax offsets or tax deductions, are reductions that reduce the amount of a consumer's tax liability. For example, consumers are given a tax deduction for the premiums that they pay for private health insurance. This means that a consumer who pays premiums for private health cover can deduct the amount of those premiums from their taxable income, that is, the income on which they pay tax, and so can reduce the amount of tax that they pay to the government. This encourages consumers to take out private health insurance. Now you might ask why the government wants to encourage consumers to buy particular types of goods and services. Surely, if consumers receive a large enough benefit from the goods and services, such as reducing their electricity costs by installing solar energy panels, reducing their water costs by installing rainwater tanks, being able to have a paying job and earn money by putting their children in childcare, being protected against COVID, or getting treatment in a private hospital by virtue of having private health insurance, then consumers, surely they'll buy those goods and services anyway. Well, the answer lies in the fact that these goods and services result in not only a benefit for the individual consumer who buys them, but also for society. Using economics language, the purchase of these goods and services results in positive externalities. A positive externality occurs where the consumption of a product gives a benefit to another person, in addition to the consumer, who does not pay for the product. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term positive externality and write this definition in there. For example, a consumer who buys solar energy panels gets the benefit of a reduced electricity bill, but the use of solar energy panels also benefits society because it means that that consumer is not taking electricity from the electricity grid, which in turn means that other electricity consumers can use that electricity. This is particularly important when there might not be enough electricity for everyone, such as on very hot days when everyone wants to use their air conditioners. A consumer who buys a rainwater tank gets the benefit of a reduced water bill, but the use of the rainwater tank also benefits society because it means that that consumer is not taking water from the treated water system, which in turn means that other water consumers can use that water. This is particularly important when there might not be enough water for everyone, such as during droughts. A consumer who uses childcare gets the benefit of being able to have a paying job and earn money by putting their children in childcare. But this also benefits society because then there are more people in the workforce who are able to produce goods and services for consumers. A consumer who is vaccinated against COVID has the benefit of being protected against COVID. But this also benefits society because it means that there are less people who will catch and spread COVID. And a consumer who takes out private health insurance gets the benefit of having treatment in a private hospital. But this also benefits society because it reduces the number of people who need to be treated in public hospitals, which are paid for by the government and therefore the taxpayer. So you can see that governments use incentives to influence consumers to purchase products where the purchase of those products is beneficial not just for the consumer, but also for society. Governments need to give incentives to encourage consumers to purchase and consume these types of products, that is, products that have positive externalities, because otherwise consumers will consume less of those products than is socially desirable, as they will only take into account the benefits of that consumption for themselves and not others. This is because, as we've seen, consumers are self-interested in that they act in their own interests to maximize their own satisfaction rather than the satisfaction of others. Let's now look at disincentives. A disincentive is something that is designed to discourage certain behaviour. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term disincentive and write this definition in there. Governments use disincentives to influence consumer decision-making by discouraging consumers from purchasing a product whose consumption is detrimental to the consumer or to society. The two most common disincentives that governments use to discourage consumers from purchasing a product are taxes on consumers and regulations. Taxes on consumers can be used by governments to discourage consumers from purchasing a product. For example, the government imposes taxes on tobacco and alcohol. This discourages consumers from buying tobacco and alcohol because the tax increases the cost of tobacco and alcohol for consumers, and so consumers will buy less of these products. Regulations can also be used by governments to discourage consumers from purchasing a product. For example, the government has made laws that prohibit consumers from taking drugs. These laws discourage consumers from taking drugs by punishing this behaviour, such as with fines or imprisonment, and so consumers are less likely to buy drugs. One reason the government might want to discourage consumers from buying particular types of goods and services is that the consumption of those goods and services could be detrimental to the consumer. Alcohol, tobacco, and drugs can all damage a consumer's health. However, an additional reason is that these goods and services are not only detrimental to the individual consumer who buys them, but they are also detrimental to society. Using economics language, the purchase of these goods and services results in negative externalities. A negative externality occurs where the consumption of a product imposes a cost on another person who is not the consumer of that product. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term negative externality and write this definition in there. For example, a consumer who buys and consumes tobacco, alcohol, or drugs runs the risk of damaging their own health. But this is also detrimental to society because the abuse of alcohol and drugs can lead to violence, crimes to support an alcohol or drug addiction, and relationship breakdowns. In addition, tobacco, alcohol, or drug abuse can mean that the person needs treatment in the public healthcare system, which is paid for by the government and therefore the taxpayer. So you can see that governments use disincentives to influence consumers not to purchase products where the purchase of those products is detrimental not just to the consumer, but also to society. Governments need to use disincentives to discourage consumers from purchasing and consuming these types of products, that is, products that have negative externalities, because otherwise consumers will consume more of those products than is socially desirable, as they will only take into account the costs of that consumption for themselves and not others. This is because, as we've seen, consumers are self-interested in that they act in their own interests to maximize their own satisfaction rather than the satisfaction of others. What I would like you to do now is to draw up this table in your summary books. To complete this table, you need to describe one example for each of the two different types of incentives, that is, consumer subsidies and tax rebates, and for each of the two different types of disincentives, that is, taxes and regulations. You then need to describe the impact of that incentive or disincentive on the decision of consumers to buy a particular product, and then describe the beneficial effect of this decision for society in the final column. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. As a result of watching and taking notes on this video, you should now be able to do two things. First, you should be able to explain the factors that affect consumer behaviour according to the traditional economic viewpoint. These factors are rationality, self-interest, informed decision-making, maximisation of utility, marginal benefits from consumption, and ordered preferences. Second, you should be able to explain the ways in which consumers and workers might respond to incentives and disincentives. These incentives and disincentives are consumer subsidies, tax rebates, taxes, and regulations. Don't forget that you now need to read the pages from the textbook referred to on the first slide of this video. And if you find any additional information from that reading that you think is useful, then make sure that you supplement your Cornell notes with that additional information. Thank you for your attention.